November 26th, 1943, 28,000 feet above the Ruhr Valley, Germany. The air inside the B-17G Flying Fortress. The Iron Lady is a swirling mix of freezing mist, cordite, and the primal stench of fear. Major Frank Buzzsaw Kowalski grips the yoke, his eyes watering from the cold and the endless strain of holding the giant aircraft steady through the roiling gray of flak bursts. The bomber shudders violently, not from enemy fire yet, but from the brutal turbulence kicked up by 100 other four-engine giants struggling to maintain the rigid geometric shape of the combat box. The entire sky is a cacophony of Pratt & Whitney engines at maximum power and the ear-splitting percussion of German Oct-Oct anti-aircraft shells. "Flak coming heavy at 11 o'clock low, Major," shouts the bombardier over the intercom. Kowalski barely registers the warning. His mind is fixed on the horizon, searching for something that has been missing for over an hour. The little friends. The P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings, the heavy, dependable escort fighters, had all reached the practical limit of their combat radius somewhere near the German border. The fighter pilots had radioed their regrets, dipped their wings in a gesture of shared dread, and turned back toward England. They simply did not carry enough fuel for the grueling final leg of the deep strike into Germany's industrial heart. For the Luftwaffe, this turning point, the geographical line where the American escorts ran dry, was their greatest tactical ally. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter of Jagdgeschwader 26 watched the bomber stream from 30,000 feet, his Messerschmitt Bf 109G a tiny, black shark in the sun. He wasn't rushing. His discipline was absolute, born of countless successful ambushes. He didn't have to risk the flak zone. The bomber crews were already exhausted, their gunners stiff from hours in the frigid air. Richter knew the immutable bloody algebra of the air war. Beyond 300 miles from the coast, the American bombers belonged to the Reich. Richter pushed the nose of his Messerschmitt down, the engine's howl a predatory scream. He led his Staffel in a wide, sweeping dive, positioning himself at the bomber's 6 o'clock high position, the most vulnerable angle. This wasn't a skirmish. It was a scheduled slaughter. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high! Plenty of them!" The warning shrieked through the Iron Lady's intercom. The German fighters were a blur of yellow noses and black crosses, exploiting the gap left by the departed Thunderbolts. They swept through the formation with frightening speed, their cannons and machine guns spitting streams of high-explosive and incendiary rounds. The combat box instantly devolved into a desperate, chaotic scrum. A B-17 3 positions to Kowalski's left, the Queen of Hearts, took a sustained burst to the No. 3 engine. It burst into a pillar of white flame and instantly began its death spiral, carrying 10 men and a full bomb load down into the heart of the enemy territory. Richter made his first pass, flying straight through the torrent of American .50 caliber defensive fire. His mind was focused only on deflection and trigger time. He saw a flying fortress explode. Not just a burst, but a catastrophic disintegration, and registered the fact with a clinical detachment. One less bomber to worry about. He pulled up, reformed his squadron, and headed for another pass. This was the routine. This was how they were winning the air battle over the fatherland. The Americans could build all the bombers they wanted, but without sustained escort, the price of deep penetration was simply too high. The German pilots knew they had the range advantage, and they intended to use it until the bomber raids simply ceased. The vast, empty sky between the coast and the target was their greatest defense. These men, American and German alike, were locked in a grinding war of attrition, paying a devastating cost for every mile of German airspace they fought over. Their sacrifice is etched into the very sky over Europe, a lesson learned in blood. But to ensure that their story and the shocking immediate change that was about to break the Luftwaffe's confidence is never forgotten, take a moment now to help us keep this history alive. By simply clicking the like button, sharing this story with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribing, you motivate us to keep digging through the archives and building these immersive historical accounts for you. January 11th, 1944. 27,500 feet, far east of Brunswick, Germany. The target was the critical fighter assembly plants around Brunswick, a strike so deep, so essential, that the 8th Air Force leadership had braced for catastrophic losses. Major Kowalski, flying the Iron Lady, was again positioned at the head of the combat box, his knuckles white against the control yoke. He had seen the calculations. He knew the odds. The established procedure was already underway. The familiar, mournful withdrawal of the Republic P-47s had happened an hour ago, somewhere over the Mittelgebirge. Kowalski felt the familiar, cold dread settle in his chest, the knowledge that the next 60 minutes would be a lottery drawn in the crosshairs of the Luftwaffe's finest. Yet this time, something was different. Far ahead, shimmering in the pale winter sun, a new shape held the horizon. Sleek, fast, with a clean, low wing and a revolutionary bubble canopy that gave its pilot 360-degree vision. It was the North American P-51 Mustang, and today it wasn't turning back. Crucially, as the formation pressed deeper, Kowalski saw the telltale sign of their revolution. 2 pale brown, cigar-shaped fuel tanks fell away from each fighter, tumbling silently toward the earth far below. The temporary external drop tanks had done their job, carrying the fighters far beyond their natural range. Now, jettisoned and discarded, the Mustang pilots had lighter aircraft, fully fueled internal tanks, and clear orders to stay with the bombers all the way to the target and back. This subtle engineering innovation, a simple pair of disposable tanks fitted to a superlative airframe, had just fundamentally rewritten the rules of the entire air war. The Luftwaffe had not been told. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter was orbiting at 32,000 feet, a hunter patiently waiting for the signal to strike. His Jagdgeschwader had sighted the bomber stream, and Richter, leading the primary intercept group, was rubbing his hands together inside his flight gloves in anticipation. The reports from the ground radar were clear. The Thunderbolts were gone. The feast was on. Achtung, Jäger! Richter's voice crackled over the radio, tense with excitement. Form up on my wing. We hit them from the sun. Target the box leader. He nosed his Bf-109G down, pulling his speed past 500 kilometers per hour, the air hissing over the canopy. He looked for the moment of chaos, the frantic defensive weaving, the lack of an outer protective shell. But as he closed in, he didn't see the familiar signs of an unescorted formation. Instead, he saw them, dozens of them, silver and deadly, maintaining a high, watchful orbit. Richter cursed aloud. The escort is still here. Verdammt! The P-38s and P-47s were too heavy, too short-legged to be here. These fighters were different. He squinted through his sight, his mind racing to identify the new, formidable threat. They were faster than the older escorts, and they were positioned perfectly, covering the altitude bands the bombers needed most. The audacity of it, they were in the heart of the Reich, well past the point of no return. Richter's wingman, Feldwebel Müller, screamed over the radio, his voice laced with disbelief. Oberleutnant, they are shedding tanks, external tanks. They have the range. The implication hit Richter like a 2-ton bomb. Their entire defensive strategy, the Luftwaffe's tactical reliance on the attrition curve, was based on the simple physics of fuel consumption. Now, the curve was gone. The Americans had bridged the gap. Richter looked down the sights of his Messerschmitt. No longer was he hunting fat, isolated bombers. He was now the prey in a deep strike ambush, facing a new, fast, and fully fueled fighter force. His strike had turned into a desperate, immediate dogfight just to stay alive. The sky, which had once been their sanctuary, had suddenly become the enemy's long-range killing field. January 11, 1944. Moments later, over Brunswick, Germany. Oberleutnant Klaus Richter had no time for strategic reflection. The moment of shock was instantly replaced by the terrifying, desperate reality of combat. He banked his Messerschmitt sharply, the high-pitched shriek of his engine a protest against the abrupt maneuver. He was trained for the hit-and-run against slow bombers. His Bf-109G was designed for vertical combat, fast climbs and dives. But the silver aircraft that now swarmed his Staffel fought differently. They were the new P-51 Mustangs, and they were superior. A Mustang, its four guns flashing, zipped past Richter's canopy in a burst of speed the Messerschmitt simply could not match in level flight. The German fighters' limited fuel intended only for a short, sharp engagement near the bomber stream before a swift return was now a crippling liability against an opponent who had effectively refueled hundreds of miles ago. "Break! Break! Do not engage in a turning fight!" Richter bellowed into the radio, his voice strained. But it was too late. His wingman, Mueller, had reflexively followed a Mustang into a tight turn, desperate to get a shot. The P-51 pilot, Lieutenant John Mac McCready, full of fuel and confident in the laminar flow-wing superiority, simply held the turn tighter. Mueller's Bf-109 stalled, snapped violently to the right, and instantly became a slow-moving target. McCready's burst of .50 caliber fire tore off the Messerschmitt's entire tail section. The fuselage, a twisted ruin, tumbled end over end, a silent testament to the Mustang's dominance. The air around the bomber stream was no longer a safe zone for the Jagdgeschwader. It was a cauldron of relentless, high-energy combat dictated entirely by the American fighters. The German pilots, who for months had approached the bombers with the confidence of predators, now found themselves fighting a defensive, losing battle on their own terms. Richter watched helplessly as two more of his colleagues were caught in a scissors maneuver by a pair of Mustangs. Their attempts to disengage and dive to safety were thwarted by the P-51's speed advantage at altitude, a direct result of the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. Back in the Iron Lady, Major Kowalski pressed his forehead against the icy window, watching the swirling chaos unfold. The sky was filled with the smoke trails of German fighters, not bombers, falling. Relief, an emotion alien to him on deep strikes, washed over the cockpit. The sight of the Mustangs, their canopies glinting in the pale sun, was not just an escort. It was a physical, tangible shield that had not broken. "My God, they're still here," the tail gunner muttered over the intercom, his voice thick with disbelief. "And they are devouring them." The American escort was no longer just fending off the German attack. They were systematically hunting down and destroying the core fighting strength of the Luftwaffe, forcing them to fight to the point of exhaustion and fuel starvation. This wasn't an interdiction. It was a sustained, two-way annihilation of German air power. Richter, running low on fuel and almost out of ammunition, realized his position was untenable. His Staffel had been virtually destroyed in less than 10 minutes. The planned, glorious strike on the unescorted bombers had become a rout. He violently shoved the control column forward and dove, pushing his Messerschmitt into a maximum speed escape, abandoning the bomber stream and, crucially, abandoning his mission. He knew that if he did not break contact now, the relentless P-51s, unburdened by range anxiety, would hunt him all the way to the ground. He had entered the fight confident of his historical, geographical advantage. He left it with the sickening certainty that the air war over the fatherland had just been irrevocably lost. The vast, empty sky was no longer a defense. It was a trap. February 1st, 1944. Luftwaffe headquarters, Berlin. The mood in the underground briefing room was not one of stern resolve, but of cold, incandescent panic. The previous 2 weeks had seen a cataclysmic, unprecedented surge in losses, and the detailed reports from surviving fighter pilots like Oberleutnant Richter were now coalescing into a single, terrifying truth. General Major Adolf Galland, Inspector of Fighters, stood before a large wall map of Europe. He was a veteran ace, the embodiment of the Luftwaffe's early swagger, but now his face was etched with exhaustion. The red marks denoting lost German fighters were clustered in new, impossible locations, not near the coast, but deep inside the Reich, over targets like Frankfurt, Brunswick, and Oschersleben. "Gentlemen," Galland began, his voice dry and strained, "the reports are no longer anomalous. They are consistent, they are confirmed, and they are fatal. We have lost 67 pilots, many of them experienced Staffel leaders, on deep escort missions where, by all laws of physics, the American fighters should have had to turn back." He stabbed a pointer at a point well east of the Ruhr. "This is the theoretical extent of the P-47's combat radius. It has been our shield, But the bombers are no longer alone. The enemy has introduced a new fighter, the P-51 Mustang, equipped with external fuel tanks that allow it to reach all of our primary targets, from the North Sea to Vienna, and return home with fuel to spare. The tanks are shed once they are empty, leaving the fighter light, fast and fully fueled for combat over the target. A horrified silence gripped the room. The simplicity of the solution was maddening. The drop tank, a throwaway piece of pressed paper or metal, had shattered the German High Command's strategic blueprint. The entire defensive strategy, built on the premise that the American 8th Air Force could only threaten them at devastating cost to themselves, had evaporated overnight. The German fighter pilots were not just losing air superiority, they were being systematically destroyed in a high-stakes war of attrition they could no longer afford. American intelligence, guided by General Karl Spaatz, had given the P-51 pilots a new, aggressive directive. Do not just protect the bombers. Seek out and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever you find them. The bombers were now merely bait, and the Mustangs were the trap. Richter's handwritten report, magnified onto a screen, detailed the harrowing dogfight, the P-51's superior speed in high-altitude pursuit, its unmatched turning radius against the Bf-109, and the complete lack of sanctuary. We were not fighting a limited-range adversary, the report concluded. We were fighting a true long-range fighter force. They stayed with us until we were forced to bail out or crash. They are the new Jaeger of the German sky. The German command had been confident that their home territory, the vast logistical challenge it posed to the Allies, was their defense. They had planned to weather the storm, pick off the unescorted bombers, and break the will of the air crews. Now, the Mustangs had turned their industrial heartland into a hunting ground. Galland looked at the map, seeing not geography, but the escalating price of oil, of raw aluminum, of irreplaceable young men. The air battle over the Reich is no longer a defense of territory, he stated, his voice a low, heavy weight of finality. It is now a decisive, winner-take-all engagement. If we lose the battle against the Mustang, we lose the war. The Allied High Command had finally closed the strategic loop, binding their heavy bombers to their escort fighters with a simple, brilliant connection. 1,000 miles of continuous, devastating protection. The air war had fundamentally shifted, and the German pilots, once the masters of the sky, now faced a relentless, all-weather, 24-hour threat they could not escape. March 6, 1944, 25,000 feet over Berlin. The objective was Operation Big Week's ultimate target, the German capital itself. Major Kowalski, his face drawn from the stress of constant deep penetration raids, felt a profound, almost luxurious sense of confidence he hadn't known months prior. Looking out from the Iron Lady's cockpit, the sight was magnificent and terrifying. An unbroken solid box of B-17s, a river of American industrial might flowing toward the most protected city in Europe. And surrounding them, in a shimmering, impenetrable layer of silver, were the Mustangs. This time, there was no mournful separation. The P-51s, led by the legendary Colonel James Goody Goodson of the 4th Fighter Group, were not flying conservatively. They were aggressive, high energy, and completely unfazed by the depth of their penetration. They were there to fight. The Luftwaffe's response was desperate and massive. They threw everything they had at the bomber stream: Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf FW-190s, even new specialized heavy fighter units known as Sturmbucke, armored to smash through the bomber formation. Oberleutnant Richter, having survived the Brunswick raid, was airborne again. He had been assigned a non-attack position, flying a high-altitude observer Rolia, humiliating recognition of his unit's decimation. From his vantage point, the sheer scale of the American protection was staggering. He watched the first wave of interceptors climb, their pilots full of suicidal courage but devoid of strategic advantage. The Mustangs didn't wait for the German fighters to reach the bombers. They lunged, using their speed and altitude advantage to attack the climbing German interceptors before they could even form up for a coordinated assault. It was the complete reversal of the November playbook. Richter watched as a flight of 4 FW-190s, built for a quick, brutal pass-through, were instantly savaged by a pair of Mustangs that came out of the sun. The Mustangs did not stop the fight at the target zone. They pursued the scattering, fleeing German pilots with a cold, terrifying efficiency. They were flying what the bomber crews had desperately prayed for: a close escort, fighters sticking so close to the heavy aircraft that they were practically welded to them. The Mustang's primary mission now had a terrifying addition: the complete destruction of the German fighter force. Over the radio, Richter heard the cries of his comrades, the frantic, gasping warnings about the Silver Devils and the relentless pressure. He heard the unmistakable staccato rattle of the Mustang's 650 caliber machine guns silencing German voices. The sheer grinding pressure of facing an enemy that had eliminated the logistical barrier of range was breaking the Luftwaffe not just tactically, but spiritually. The Battle of Berlin on March 6, 1944 became one of the most devastating single-day losses for the Luftwaffe of the entire war. The 8th Air Force lost 69 heavy bombers, a horrific toll. But the German fighter arm lost 69 of its own irreplaceable aircraft and pilots, a straight-up exchange that the Allies could afford and Germany could not. Richter turned his Bf-109 back toward base, the bombing of Berlin a distant growing plume of smoke behind him. He looked down, seeing the German landscape passing beneath his wings, a land he had sworn to defend with an air force he now realized was a hollow shell. The long-range P-51, the little friend that never left, had not only saved the American bomber crews, but had systematically dismantled the Luftwaffe's ability to defend the Reich, effectively guaranteeing Allied air superiority until the war's final days. The shock of the German pilots had given way to a grim reality. The air war was over.